The flash of cameras felt like an assault. Sharp, relentless, unforgiving. Each click of the shutter was another nail in the coffin of Nick Hartman's reputation. He was drowning, but not in water. He was drowning in his own recklessness, his own foolishness, and the weight of the gazes on him was unbearable. The gala hall, glittering with chandeliers and polished marble floors, was alive with murmurs. A few minutes ago, Nick had been at the center of the event, raising a champagne glass as the heir to Hartman Pharmaceuticals, the face of innovation, the golden child of an empire built on decades of hard work. Now, all he could feel was the sharp sting of humiliation. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a suffocating fog, each word twisting like a knife in his chest. Did you see how drunk he is? He's a mess. Just like his father. They say he's not fit to run the company. And after this? He might never get the chance. Nick's heart raced. His mouth was dry. Panic set in as the crowd stared, their eyes judging him, dissecting him. His carefully curated persona, the charming, carefree socialite, was unraveling in real time. He could feel his image crumbling, every laugh and smirk from the audience tearing at the edges of his dignity. The gala was supposed to be a celebration of the company's charitable efforts, a night where Hartman Pharmaceuticals would bask in the glory of their contributions to healthcare and medicine. But Nick, in a moment of arrogance and defiance, had made a spectacle of himself. The champagne had flowed too freely, the pressure of living up to his father's legacy too heavy. He had tried to escape the weight of expectations with a few drinks, then a few more. And now, the fallout was imminent. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet as he tried to regain composure. His tailored suit, once a symbol of his wealth and power, now clung to him awkwardly, disheveled, soaked in sweat. His hands trembled slightly as he attempted to straighten his tie. Everything was spiraling out of control, and the worst part? He had no one to blame but himself. Suddenly, he felt a firm grip on his arm. His mother, Victoria Hartman, was a towering figure of control, precision, and ambition, dressed in a sleek, black gown. Her icy blue eyes locked onto Nick with a ferocity that sent a shiver down his spine. Her voice was low, cutting through the noise like a blade. "You're making a fool of yourself, Nick, and you're destroying everything we've worked for." Nick's throat tightened. His mother had always been a force in his life, a constant reminder that Hartmans didn't fail. They didn't stumble. They didn't show weakness. Yet here he was, proving every critic, every doubter, every board member who thought he wasn't ready to lead, absolutely right. The weight of her disappointment was suffocating, and for a moment, he felt like a child again, desperate for her approval, desperate to prove he wasn't the screw-up everyone thought he was. "Mom, he began, his voice shaky, barely audible over the noise of the room. "Enough," she snapped, her grip tightening on his arm. "You're going to fix this, one way or another." Her words sent a cold shock through his system. There was no warmth in her tone, no softness, just ice. Victoria Hartman had no room for sympathy, not when her legacy, her company, her reputation were on the line. Nick swallowed hard, his mind racing. Fix this? How was he supposed to fix something that was already broken beyond repair? The whispers continued, a steady hum of condemnation that followed him even as his mother pulled him towards the exit. The ballroom, filled with elites and power players from across the city, blurred around him. All he could focus on was the pit of dread that was growing in his stomach, the suffocating realization that tonight had been the beginning of the end. As they exited the grand hall, the cool night air hit his face like a slap. Nick inhaled sharply, trying to clear his head. But there was no clarity to be found, only the cold grip of reality. "I'm done covering for you, Nick," Victoria said, releasing his arm and turning to face him. The streetlights cast a harsh glow on her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her features. She was beautiful, elegant, and completely ruthless. Your father would be ashamed of what you've become." Nick winced at the mention of his father. His father had been everything he wasn't: strong, decisive, respected. And now, in the wake of his death, Nick was supposed to fill his shoes. But how could he? Every step he took seemed to push him further from the man his father had been. "I'll do better," Nick muttered, though the words felt empty even as they left his lips. "No," Victoria said sharply. "You've had your chances. This time, there will be consequences." Nick's heart pounded. Consequences? What did she mean by that? His mind raced, trying to anticipate what she had planned. His mother was not a woman to be trifled with. When she made a decision, it was final, and there was no escaping it. "You're going to fix your image," she continued, her voice as cold as ever. "And I've already decided how you're going to do it." Nick's stomach dropped. There was a finality in her tone that terrified him. Whatever she had planned, it wouldn't be simple. It wouldn't be painless. His life, already in shambles, was about to get even more complicated. "You're getting married," Victoria said flatly, her eyes never leaving his. "To Lily Thompson." The words hit him like a freight train. Marriage? To a woman he barely knew? Lily Thompson was an ordinary nurse, a nobody compared to the women who usually populated Nick's world of wealth and privilege. He'd met her once at one of the hospitals Hartman Pharmaceuticals supported, but she had made no lasting impression. Why would his mother force him into a marriage with her? "This will fix your image," Victoria continued, her voice never wavering. "People will see you as responsible, grounded, committed. And more importantly, it will make sure you understand what it means to sacrifice, to work hard for something. Something you've never understood." Nick stared at her in disbelief, his mind spinning. This couldn't be happening. His mother had always been manipulative, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. "I'm not marrying her," Nick said, his voice firm for the first time that night. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Yes, you are." And just like that, Nick Hartman, once the golden boy of the Hartman Empire, found himself facing the one thing he had always feared most: a life that was no longer his own. Nick stared blankly at the ceiling of his penthouse apartment, the echo of his mother's words still ringing in his ears. Marriage? He was still grappling with the weight of that bombshell. It wasn't just that he didn't want to marry Lily Thompson. He barely knew her. But this wasn't about love or partnership. This was about control, about saving face. He'd spent the last decade building a reputation, even if that reputation was one of a carefree, reckless playboy. It had been his identity. Now, it was being stripped away, along with his autonomy. His mother, ever calculating, had devised this marriage as a punishment, a way to bind him to a life he had never asked for and couldn't escape from. Nick pulled himself up from the couch, pacing the length of the room. His mind was racing. Everywhere he turned, there seemed to be a reminder of his mistakes. The media had already latched onto his misstep at the gala, headlines blaring things like "Hartman Heir crashes charity event" and "Nick Hartman, party boy or future CEO?" His face was plastered across gossip columns and financial magazines alike. His recklessness had become entertainment for the masses, a spectacle for everyone to watch him unravel. Worse still, the board of Hartman Pharmaceuticals was losing faith. He had heard rumors of secret meetings, of whispered discussions about whether Nick was truly the right man to take over the company. They smelled weakness, and in the business world, weakness was a death sentence. He knew it wouldn't be long before someone tried to make a move. A rival, an opportunist, maybe even someone within the company. The sharks were circling, and Nick was bleeding. The door to Nick's apartment swung open suddenly, breaking his chain of thought. His mother's personal assistant, a sharply dressed woman named Evelyn, stepped inside. Evelyn was Victoria's right hand, a constant shadow of efficiency and cold professionalism. "Your mother has requested your presence at the office," she said without preamble. Now, Nick groaned inwardly. Of course she had. He hadn't even had time to process the idea of this forced marriage, and already his mother was pulling strings behind the scenes, manipulating his every move. He grabbed his jacket, ignoring the knot of tension forming in his stomach, and followed Evelyn out the door. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. The ride to Hartman Pharmaceuticals felt like an eternity. Nick watched the city blur past through the tinted windows, his mind still racing with questions. How had it all gotten so bad? How had he allowed things to spiral this far out of control? When the car pulled up to the company headquarters, a towering glass structure that screamed wealth and power, Nick's gut twisted. This place had once felt like home, a symbol of everything his father had built. Now, it felt like a cage. Inside, the tension was palpable. Employees moved quickly, avoiding eye contact as Nick made his way to the executive floor. He could feel their judgment, their pity. Nick Hartman, the prodigal son, walking through the halls of the empire he was meant to inherit, an empire he was slowly destroying. When he stepped into the conference room, his mother was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by members of the board. They all looked at him with a mixture of disdain and disappointment. The room was silent, oppressive. "Nick," Victoria said, her voice clipped. "Sit." Nick's eyes darted around the room, sensing immediately that something was wrong. The air was thick with tension, heavier than usual. Even the board members, typically polished and composed, looked uneasy. "What's going on?" Nick asked, though he already had a sinking feeling in his gut. Victoria exchanged a glance with one of the board members, a man named Samuel Bishop, Hartman's head of research and development. Bishop was a seasoned professional, one of the few people Nick's father had trusted implicitly. He was also one of the few people who had always believed in Nick, at least until recently. "There's been a development in one of our projects," Bishop began, his voice steady but grim. "A critical development. The clinical trials for our new treatment have hit a major roadblock. The results aren't what we expected, and the drug isn't working," Victoria interrupted, her tone flat. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Nick felt his pulse quicken. This was bad. Very bad. The treatment in question was supposed to be Hartman Pharmaceuticals' next big breakthrough, an innovative drug designed to treat a rare, debilitating disease. The company had invested millions into its development, and it was one of the cornerstones of their future growth strategy. "If we don't fix this," Victoria continued, "we could be looking at a significant hit to our stock value. Investors are already nervous after recent events." Nick clenched his jaw. She didn't need to spell it out. Recent events was code for his public meltdown and the growing perception that he was unfit to lead. "And that's not all," Bishop added, his voice dropping lower. "We suspect there may be internal sabotage." Nick blinked, caught off guard. "Sabotage?" Bishop nodded, his expression grave. "Someone's been manipulating the data. We're not sure how deep it goes yet, but it's clear that someone within the company is trying to derail the project. This isn't just an accident, Nick. Someone is actively working against us." Nick's mind reeled. Sabotage? Internal betrayal? It sounded like something out of a corporate thriller, not the real world. But then again, the pharmaceutical industry was cutthroat. Competitors would do anything to get ahead, even if it meant playing dirty. "Who?" Nick asked, his voice hoarse. "Do we know who's behind it?" "We have some leads," Bishop said carefully, "but nothing concrete yet. We need more time to investigate." Nick felt a wave of helplessness crash over him. This was supposed to be his moment, the chance to prove himself, to step into his father's shoes and show everyone that he was capable of leading. But instead, the walls were closing in on him. The company was on the brink of disaster, and someone inside was pulling the strings. As the meeting dragged on, Nick found it harder and harder to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the looming marriage, to the chaos that was now his life. He had always thought of himself as invincible, untouchable, but now he was being dragged under by forces he couldn't control. His mother, the board, the press, and now a faceless saboteur within his own company. "Nick?" Victoria's voice snapped him back to reality. She was staring at him, her eyes cold and calculating. "Did you hear what I said?" He hadn't. His thoughts were a tangled mess, his emotions a raw, exposed nerve. Everything was falling apart. I said, Victoria repeated. We're going to need you to step up. Nick blinked, trying to process her words. Step up how? Victoria exchanged a glance with Bishop before speaking. You're going to be the face of the company during this crisis. The press will be all over this story as soon as it breaks, and we need you to show them that Hartman Pharmaceuticals is still strong, that we're still in control. Nick's stomach twisted. This was the last thing he needed. His public image was already in tatters. How was he supposed to convince the world that everything was fine when he could barely convince himself? I don't think. You don't have a choice, Victoria interrupted, her voice hard as steel. You've made enough mistakes, Nick. This is your opportunity to make things right. You owe it to this company. You owe it to your father's legacy. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His father's legacy. That was the weight that had always hung over him. The impossible standard he had never been able to live up to. And now, it was being used against him, like a weapon. For a moment, Nick considered pushing back, refusing to play the role his mother had scripted for him. But then he thought of the alternative, losing everything. The company, the fortune, the respect of the few people who still believed in him. He couldn't afford to lose any more. Fine, Nick said, his voice hollow. I'll do it. Meanwhile, across town, Lily Thompson was facing her own crisis. The hospital where she worked was buzzing with rumors about her upcoming marriage to Nick Hartman. She had thought she could keep it quiet, at least for a little while, but news in the world of the rich and powerful traveled fast. Nurses and doctors whispered behind her back, their eyes full of curiosity and judgment. Lily had always been proud of her independence, of the life she had built for herself. Now, she felt like a pawn in someone else's game. She had agreed to marry Nick for one reason only: money. Her sister, Emma, was sick, critically sick, and the medical bills were piling up faster than she could handle. When Victoria Hartman had approached her with the proposition, Lily had been shocked. Marry Nick Hartman, the infamous playboy? It sounded absurd, but the offer was too good to refuse. In exchange for her cooperation, Victoria had promised to cover all of Emma's medical expenses. It wasn't about love. It wasn't even about Nick. It was about survival. But as the reality of the situation began to sink in, Lily couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. She was about to marry a man she barely knew, for reasons that had nothing to do with affection or connection. What kind of life was she signing up for? Nick leaned back in the leather chair of his office, staring out at the city skyline. The world outside looked peaceful, distant, quiet. But inside the walls of Hartman Pharmaceuticals, chaos brewed. The clinical trial sabotage, the looming press conferences, the weight of his upcoming marriage to Lily. It was all closing in on him. He had managed to put out fires for days, but now, things felt different. There was something bigger lurking beneath the surface, something he couldn't quite grasp, and it was eating at him. The pressure was suffocating. His mother's demands, the board's distrust, and the growing uncertainty about who was behind the sabotage were pushing him to the edge. He felt like a man teetering on the brink, ready to fall at any moment. His phone buzzed on the desk, the screen flashing with a message from Bishop. "We need to meet. Urgent." Nick frowned. It wasn't like Bishop to be dramatic. He'd been one of the more level-headed figures in the company, a steady presence who'd worked closely with Nick's father for decades. If Bishop said something was urgent, it usually meant there was more trouble brewing. Without wasting another moment, Nick grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. Hartman Pharmaceuticals' Research and Development Wing was a fortress of innovation. Labs buzzing with activity, researchers working around the clock to create the next medical breakthrough. Nick walked through the sterile hallways, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go very, very wrong. He found Bishop waiting for him in one of the private conference rooms, the tension in the air thick. Bishop wasn't alone. Beside him stood Eva Martinez, the company's chief data analyst, a woman known for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense attitude. She looked troubled, her usual confidence replaced with a flicker of uncertainty. "What's going on?" Nick asked, taking a seat. "You said it was urgent." Bishop exchanged a glance with Eva before speaking. "We've been digging deeper into the sabotage." Nick's stomach clenched. "And we found something. Something we didn't expect." Bishop's voice was heavy with implication. He slid a folder across the table toward Nick. "This is going to be hard to believe, but you need to see this." Nick opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. At first, the data looked like any other research report. Numbers, graphs, charts. But as he read further, his blood ran cold. There were inconsistencies, manipulated results, and, most shockingly, a direct connection to one of the company's highest-ranking executives. His eyes shot up to meet Bishop's. "Who did this?" Bishop hesitated, his face grim. "It's your mother, Nick." For a moment, Nick couldn't process what he'd just heard. His mother? That was impossible. She was ruthless, yes, but she would never sabotage her own company. Would she? "There's no mistake," Eva chimed in, her voice steady but filled with regret. "We've cross-checked the data multiple times. All the falsified reports lead back to Victoria's office. It looks like she's been manipulating the trial results for months." Nick felt the ground shift beneath him. His mother? The woman who had built this company alongside his father. The woman who had spent years grooming him to take over. She was the one responsible for the sabotage? None of it made sense. "That can't be true," Nick said, shaking his head. "Why would she do this?" Bishop sighed, leaning forward. "We believe it has to do with her need for control." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Victoria's been positioning herself for more power, especially since your father's death. It's possible she saw the clinical trials as a threat to her authority. Maybe she thought delaying the project would give her more leverage with the board." Nick's mind raced, the pieces starting to fall into place. It had always been about control with her. From the moment he was old enough to understand what the family business meant, his mother had been shaping him, molding him into the heir she wanted. She had orchestrated every move, every decision in his life, down to the forced marriage with Lily. And now this. He felt sick. How could she do this to the company? To him? His thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and betrayal. It was as if the floor had been pulled out from under him, and for the first time in his life, Nick realized how little control he had ever truly had. Hours later, Nick found himself standing in the grand office that once belonged to his father. His mother was behind the massive oak desk, reviewing papers as if it were just another day. She looked up when Nick entered, her face calm, almost serene. "Nick," she said, her voice measured. "I assume you're here to talk about the press conference tomorrow." Nick's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "No, Mother. I'm here to talk about the sabotage." For the first time, Victoria's composure faltered. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she set her papers down with deliberate slowness. "I know what you've done," Nick continued, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "I know you've been manipulating the trial data. I know you've been sabotaging the project." Victoria's gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. "You don't understand." Nick slammed his hand on the desk, his frustration boiling over. "Then make me understand. You're risking everything we've built, everything Dad worked for." Victoria rose from her chair, her posture unyielding. "Your father is gone, Nick, and this company needs someone who knows how to lead it. Someone with the strength and vision to make the hard decisions. And you think sabotaging our own trials is the way to do that?" Nick shot back, disbelief laced in his tone. "You're destroying the company from the inside." "I'm protecting it," Victoria snapped, her eyes blazing. "Do you really think you're ready to run this company? After the way you've acted? After everything you've done?" The words hit Nick like a punch to the gut. His mother had never believed in him. Not really. She had tolerated his role as the heir because she had no other choice. But in her eyes, he would never be good enough. He would always be the reckless, irresponsible son who couldn't measure up to his father's legacy. "I'm your son," Nick said, his voice breaking. "I should be the one you're protecting, not undermining. You can't keep controlling everything. You have to let go." Victoria's face softened for a brief moment, a flicker of emotion passing through her icy exterior. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. "I can't let go," she said quietly. "Not when everything is at stake. This company, our family's legacy, it's too important. More important than your feelings. More important than your pride." Nick shook his head, disbelief coursing through him. This wasn't just about the company. It was about control. It had always been about control. His mother didn't trust him, didn't believe he was capable of running Hartman Pharmaceuticals without her hand guiding every decision, pulling every string. "Do you even care about me?" Nick asked, his voice raw. "Or am I just another piece in your game?" Victoria's silence was answer enough. Nick stormed out of the office, his mind racing. Everything had changed. He had always known his relationship with his mother was complicated, but he had never imagined it would come to this. The woman who had shaped his entire life, the woman who had molded him into the man he was today, had been undermining him from the start. The betrayal cut deep, deeper than anything he had ever felt before. But along with the hurt came a clarity that Nick had never known. He couldn't keep living under his mother's shadow. He couldn't keep letting her pull the strings in his life, in the company. For the first time in his life, Nick realized he had to take control. Real control, not just of the company, but of his future. He couldn't let his mother dictate his decisions any longer. But he couldn't do it alone. Across town, Lily sat at her kitchen table, staring at the contract that bound her to Nick Hartman. It was official now. The marriage was happening. Victoria Hartman had made it clear that backing out wasn't an option, not if she wanted to keep her sister's medical bills covered. But as the wedding day loomed closer, Lily's doubts were growing stronger. She had agreed to this arrangement out of desperation, out of a need to protect her sister. But now, she was starting to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Could she really marry a man she barely knew? A man whose life was so far removed from her own, whose world was filled with power games and corporate intrigue. And could she live with herself knowing that her decision was driven by necessity rather than choice? As Lily pondered her situation, her phone buzzed. It was Nick. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Lily, we need to talk," Nick said, his voice tense. Lily's heart skipped a beat. Something was different. She could hear it in his voice. "What is it?" she asked, her stomach tightening. "There's been a change," Nick said, his voice low. "I'm not going to let my mother control my life anymore. Not the company. Not this marriage. We need to talk about what happens next." Nick stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the city sprawling out beneath him, its lights flickering like stars against the night. From here, everything looked so small, so distant, like the problems of the world couldn't reach him. But Nick knew better. He was trapped in a fight he couldn't escape, not this time. The weight of everything, his mother's betrayal, the sabotage at Hartman Pharmaceuticals, the marriage to Lily, pressed down on him like a vice. He could feel it constricting, squeezing, and yet he couldn't afford to break. Not now. Not when everything was about to come crashing down. His phone buzzed on the table behind him. Lily's name flashed on the screen. He hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice tight. "Lily, we need to meet," she said. Her voice was steady, but Nick could hear the tension beneath it. "There's something we need to talk about. I think it's important." Nick ran a hand through his hair, his frustration boiling over. Everything was happening at once. The press was hounding him about the company's impending crisis. The board was putting pressure on him to make public statements, and now he could feel Lily slipping through his fingers. She hadn't agreed to marry him out of love. He knew that, but it didn't make it any easier to face. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. The cafe where they met was small and quiet, tucked away from the bustling streets of the city. Lily sat at a corner table, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She looked tired, the weight of her own troubles etched in the lines of her face. Nick felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't asked for this marriage, but neither had she. They were both trapped in a web spun by his mother, their lives entangled in a way neither of them could have predicted. He slid into the seat across from her, his eyes searching her face for some sign of what was to come. Lily didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I can't do this, Nick." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Nick's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already knew. "I can't marry you," Lily said, her voice softer now, but no less certain. "I thought I could, that I could go through with it for my sister's sake. But it doesn't feel right. None of this feels right." Nick looked away, his jaw clenched. He couldn't blame her. He knew this marriage had been a business transaction from the start, a way to salvage his public image and secure her sister's medical treatments. But in the weeks leading up to the wedding, he had started to hope that maybe things could be different, that maybe they could find some way to make it work. But now, as he stared into Lily's eyes, he realized that hope had been foolish. "I understand," Nick said quietly, though the words felt like gravel in his throat. "But this isn't just about us anymore, Lily. This is about the company, about everything my father built. If we don't go through with this, the fallout will be catastrophic." Lily frowned, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "Is that really what you want, Nick? To be trapped in a marriage neither of us wants, just to save the company?" Nick's chest tightened. He didn't have an answer for that. What did he want? He'd spent his entire life doing what was expected of him, following the path his mother had laid out for him, even when it felt like it was killing him. And now, here he was, on the brink of losing everything. His company, his future, and the one person who had shown him a glimpse of something real. "I don't know what I want," Nick admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that I can't lose the company. Not after everything that's happened." Lily looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the decision. "I'll go through with the marriage," she said finally, her voice flat. "But only because I don't want to see you lose everything. Not because I believe in this." Nick's heart sank. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. But what choice did he have? He couldn't afford to lose the company, and without Lily, his mother would have complete control. He couldn't let that happen. "Thank you," he said, though the words felt hollow. "I know this isn't what either of us wanted." Lily nodded, her eyes sad but resolute. "No, it's not." Days passed in a blur of meetings, press briefings, and tense conversations with the board. The sabotage investigation was still ongoing, but the deeper they dug, the more complicated things became. Every lead seemed to dead end, every piece of evidence pointing to a tangled web of deceit that stretched further than Nick could have imagined. And through it all, his mother remained a looming presence, her grip on the company tightening with every passing day. She had been silent since their confrontation, but Nick knew she was waiting for him to fail, waiting for her moment to seize control once and for all. The day of the wedding was fast approaching, but Nick could barely focus on the details. His mind was consumed by the crisis at the company, by the growing unrest among the board members, and by the constant whispers of his inadequacy. And then, the final blow came. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. It was late when Nick received the call. He had been sitting in his office, staring blankly at the stack of papers in front of him, when his phone buzzed with a message from Bishop. "Come to the lab. We found something." Nick's pulse quickened. This was it. They had finally uncovered the truth behind the sabotage. He grabbed his coat and headed for the lab, his mind racing with possibilities. Who could it be? A competitor? An ambitious executive looking to take his place? Someone with a vendetta against his family? When he arrived, Bishop was waiting for him, his face pale and drawn. Something was wrong. "What is it?" Nick asked, his voice tight. Bishop hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. Nick, I don't know how to tell you this. Nick's heart pounded in his chest. Just tell me, Bishop. Bishop swallowed hard, then handed Nick a file. Nick's hands shook as he opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. What he saw made his blood run cold. The data, the falsified reports, the sabotage. It wasn't just some rogue employee or outside influence. It was Lily. Nick stumbled back, his mind reeling. No, it couldn't be. Lily had nothing to do with the company, nothing to gain from sabotaging the trials. But the evidence was there, staring him in the face. Her name, her signature on the documents. She had been the one feeding information to their competitors, the one undermining everything he had worked for. Bishop watched him carefully, his voice quiet. I'm sorry, Nick. I didn't want to believe it either. But there's no denying the evidence. Nick's world tilted on its axis. Lily? The woman he had been preparing to marry, the woman who had stood by his side through all of this. She had been the one orchestrating the downfall of his company? It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. She was working with someone. Bishop continued. We think there's a larger group involved, but we haven't been able to track down all the players yet. She's just the tip of the iceberg. Nick's vision blurred. His hands shook as he gripped the edge of the desk, his mind spinning out of control. How could she do this to him? After everything they had been through, after everything she had promised? His chest heaved, a raw, guttural anger rising inside him. He had trusted her. He had allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. And now, she had destroyed everything. I have to talk to her, Nick said, his voice shaking with rage. Bishop nodded, though he looked unsure. Are you sure that's a good idea, Nick? You're not thinking clearly. I don't care, Nick snapped. I need answers. Nick stormed into Lily's apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. She was sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn, as if she had been expecting this. Why? Nick demanded, his voice cracking with anger. Why did you do it, Lily? Why did you betray me? Lily didn't flinch. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a deep sadness that Nick hadn't expected. For a moment, he saw a flicker of the woman he thought he had known, the woman who had stood by his side, even when she didn't have to. I didn't have a choice, she said softly. Nick's heart twisted. What do you mean you didn't have a choice? You could have told me. You could have come to me instead of doing this. Lily shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Nick. I didn't want to hurt you. But they had my sister. They threatened to cut off her treatment if I didn't cooperate. Nick froze. Her sister. He had known how desperate Lily had been to save her, but he hadn't realized how far she had been pushed. He hadn't seen it. Hadn't seen how much pressure she was under, how helpless she must have felt. They told me it was just information, Lily continued, her voice shaking. They said it wouldn't hurt anyone, that it was just corporate espionage, that no one would get hurt. But I didn't know it would lead to this. Nick's rage faltered, replaced by a wave of guilt and sorrow. He had been so focused on saving the company, on protecting his own legacy, that he hadn't seen how much Lily was suffering. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry, Nick. For a moment, Nick didn't know what to say. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, sorrow. But beneath it all, there was something else, understanding. He had been trapped by his own fears, his own need to live up to his father's legacy. And Lily had been trapped, too, trapped by a system that had used her sister's life as leverage. They were both pawns in a game they hadn't chosen to play. Nick sank down onto the couch beside her, his head in his hands. He didn't know what to do. Everything he had worked for was crumbling around him, and the one person he thought he could rely on had betrayed him. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to hate her. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted, his voice raw. Lily looked at him, her eyes filled with pain. Neither do I. In the days that followed, Nick found himself at a crossroads. The company was in free fall. The press was circling like vultures, and the board was preparing to force him out. But something had shifted in Nick. He was no longer the man who had stumbled into this mess, blinded by privilege and arrogance. He had seen the darkest parts of the world he lived in, the betrayals, the manipulation, the ruthlessness, and he had survived. Now, he had to make a choice. He could walk away, let his mother take control of the company, and leave everything behind. Or he could fight. Fight for his father's legacy, fight for the company, fight for the people who believed in him, even if it meant going to war with his own mother. And then there was Lily. She had betrayed him, yes, but she had also been a victim of forces beyond her control. Could he forgive her? Could he trust her again? Or was this the end of whatever fragile connection they had shared? In the end, Nick made his decision. Nick stood in front of the towering glass doors of Hartman Pharmaceuticals, the cold air biting at his skin. He took a deep breath, his chest heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure, the culmination of everything that had brought him to this point. The betrayal, the sabotage, the forced marriage. But more than anything, it was the moment he would have to confront the person who had shaped his life since the day he was born, his mother. He glanced up at the building, the empire his father had built, the legacy he was supposed to inherit. It had once filled him with pride, but now, all he felt was a deep, gnawing sense of unease. Everything had changed. He wasn't the man who had walked into this office weeks ago, brimming with confidence and ignorance. Now, he knew the truth about his mother, about Lily, and about himself. With a final breath, Nick pushed through the doors and made his way to the executive floor. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. Victoria Hartman was waiting for him in her office, sitting behind the large mahogany desk that had once belonged to his father. She looked as composed as ever, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. There was no sign of the turmoil she had caused, no hint of remorse for the betrayal she had orchestrated. To the outside world, she was still the untouchable queen of Hartman Pharmaceuticals. Nick entered the room, his steps measured, his eyes locked on his mother. This wasn't going to be easy. He had spent his whole life trying to earn her approval, to live up to the expectations she had set for him. And now, he was here to confront the woman who had manipulated him, sabotaged the company, and betrayed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. "Nick," Victoria said, her voice calm and controlled. "I didn't expect you to come in today." Nick stood across from her, the desk a symbolic barrier between them. He could feel the tension in the room, thick and heavy, but he wasn't the same man who had once cowered under his mother's gaze. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. "About the company, about what you've done." Victoria raised an eyebrow, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "What I've done," she repeated, her tone almost mocking. "Nick, everything I've done has been for this company, for our family. You may not understand it now, but one day you will. Running a business like this requires hard decisions, sacrifices." Nick felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. He had heard this argument before, this justification for every manipulation, every betrayal she had committed in the name of protecting the company. But he wasn't here to be lectured, and he wasn't going to let her twist the narrative anymore. "You sabotaged our clinical trials," Nick said, his voice firm. "You manipulated the results to delay the project and undermine my leadership. You've been working behind the scenes to destabilize everything I've tried to build." Victoria didn't flinch. She was always in control, always a step ahead. "I did what needed to be done. Those trials were a risk. The company couldn't afford a failure, especially not with you at the helm, making decisions you weren't ready to make." Nick stared at her, disbelief tightening in his chest. She still didn't see it. She didn't see him as capable, didn't believe in him, even after everything. "You never trusted me to lead, did you?" he asked, his voice raw with the weight of the realization. Victoria's eyes hardened. "You've never shown me that you were ready." Nick's heart pounded in his chest. The years of frustration, the feelings of inadequacy, all came rushing to the surface. He had spent his whole life trying to prove himself to her, to be the son she wanted him to be, but it was never enough. No matter how hard he tried, he would always be the reckless, irresponsible boy in her eyes. But that was the old Nick. The man standing before her now was different. He had faced his darkest fears, weathered betrayal, and come out stronger on the other side. "I'm not that boy anymore," Nick said, his voice calm but firm. "I've made mistakes, yes, but I've learned from them. I've seen what this company can be, and I'm ready to lead it. Not the way you want, but in my own way." Victoria's lips thinned, her eyes narrowing. "You're not ready, Nick. You'll never be ready. This company will fall apart under your leadership, just like you fell apart at that gala." The words stung, but Nick didn't let them affect him. He had changed. He wasn't going to let her manipulate him anymore. "That's where you're wrong," he said quietly. "I'm ready now, more than ever. And I won't let you destroy what's left of this company because you can't let go." Victoria stood, her face a mask of cold fury. "You think you can just take over? After everything I've done to keep this company afloat?" "I don't think, Mother," Nick said, his voice steady. "I know, and I'm not asking for your permission. I'm taking it." For the first time, Victoria looked genuinely surprised. She had always been the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now, Nick was standing in front of her, no longer the obedient son who followed her every command. He had found his strength, his voice, and he wasn't backing down. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone icy. Nick nodded, his jaw set. "I've already spoken to the board. They're backing me." It was a lie, at least for now, but Nick knew the board was close to siding with him. The sabotage had shaken their trust in Victoria, and they were ready for a change. He just needed to push her out, to make her realize that her reign was over. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them palpable. This was the moment of truth, the final battle for control. Victoria's eyes bore into his, and for the first time, Nick saw something there that he had never seen before: fear. "You've made a mistake, Nick," she said, her voice cold as steel. "One that you won't be able to recover from." Nick shook his head. "No, Mother. The mistake was thinking you could control me forever." If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. Nick left the office, his heart pounding in his chest, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: freedom. He had finally broken free of his mother's control, and though the road ahead would be difficult, he knew he was ready to face it. He had spoken to the board earlier that morning, laying out his vision for the company's future, his plan to rebuild the trust they had lost, and to move forward with the clinical trials. It hadn't been easy. There were still doubters, people who weren't sure he was the right man for the job. But Nick had been honest with them, admitting his mistakes, acknowledging his flaws. And in that honesty, he had found strength. The board had agreed to give him a chance, one chance, to prove that he could lead the company. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a start. And for Nick, that was enough. Later that night, Nick found himself standing outside Lily's apartment, his heart heavy with everything that had transpired between them. He had been avoiding this moment, afraid of what he might say, afraid of what she might say. But he couldn't avoid it forever. He needed answers, and more than that, he needed closure. He knocked on the door, his chest tightening as he heard footsteps approaching. When the door opened, Lily stood there, looking as tired and broken as he felt. "Nick," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Nick didn't know where to begin, didn't know how to make sense of the tangled mess of emotions swirling inside him. "I need to know," Nick said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "I need to know why you did it," Lily sighed, stepping aside to let him in. She closed the door behind him and turned to face him, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I didn't want to hurt you, Nick," she said softly. "I was trapped. They had my sister. They threatened to stop her treatment if I didn't cooperate. I didn't know what else to do. Nick's chest tightened. He had been so focused on his own pain, his own betrayal, that he hadn't truly considered what Lily had been going through. She had been caught in a nightmare, just like him, forced to make impossible choices to protect the people she loved. I should have told you, Lily continued, her voice trembling, but I was scared. I was scared that if you knew the truth, you wouldn't forgive me, that you would hate me. Nick shook his head, his heart aching. I could never hate you, Lily. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Nick felt the distance between them start to close. They were both broken, both trying to find their way in a world that had pushed them to their limits. And in that shared pain, Nick realized something. He didn't want to lose her. I don't know how to fix this, Nick said, his voice soft but firm. But I want to try. Lily looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. And when she saw none, she nodded. Me too, she whispered. In the weeks that followed, Nick threw himself into rebuilding Hartman Pharmaceuticals. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, moments when he wondered if he was truly capable of leading the company his father had built. But through it all, Nick held on to one thing: the belief that he could change, that he could be more than the man he had once been. He worked closely with the board, earning their trust, showing them that he was committed to the company's future. He made tough decisions, but they were his decisions, no longer dictated by his mother, no longer driven by fear or insecurity. And through it all, Lily stood by his side. Their relationship wasn't perfect. There were still wounds that needed to heal, trust that needed to be rebuilt. But they were both willing to put in the work, to face the challenges together. As the months passed, Nick began to see the fruits of his labor. The company's stock began to recover, the clinical trials moved forward, and the board started to view him not as a liability, but as a leader. He hadn't won yet, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. More importantly, Nick had found something even more valuable than success. He had found himself. He was no longer the boy living in his father's shadow, no longer the son trying to earn his mother's approval. He was his own man, with his own vision, his own values. And that, for Nick Hartman, was the greatest victory of all. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey of growth and transformation. If this story touched you as much as it did us, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming emotional, twist-filled stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below and tell us which part impacted you the most or what your favorite moment was. Your feedback means the world to us. And before you go, be sure to click on the next video on your screen. The next story is sure to surprise you. See you there.